I want to invite your attention this morning to the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 3. The Gospel according to Mark, chapter 3, beginning at verse 1. And it reads as follows. Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. Jesus looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." The man stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. I want to talk about this morning for a few minutes, breaking the rules. Breaking the rules. On February 4th, 2015, a 911 call was placed to the Galax Police Department in Galax, Virginia. Galax, Virginia is about 148 miles north of North Carolina. 17-month-old Aiden Walker was asleep with his grandmother. At some point during the nap, Aiden's grandmother realized that little Aiden had stopped breathing. In a frantic state, she yelled to Aiden's mom to call 911. Tim Webb, the 911 dispatcher, listened to Aiden's mom describe how little Aiden had stopped breathing and was unresponsive. Little Aiden had a seizure, and neither one of the ladies knew what to do, and little Aiden's life was about to slip away. The mother and grandmother screamed frantically, not knowing what to do, while Aiden's little body was lying lifeless. Tim Webb, the dispatcher, asked if either one of the women knew CPR, but they did not. The nearest ambulance was about 20 minutes away, and Aiden's mom pleaded with Tim, asking if there was anything he could do. And although Tim, the dispatcher, knew CPR, it was against departmental policy for him to tell her how to do it over the phone. The department needed a special certification to give out that kind of information. And at that moment, Tim knew that if he did not tell little Aiden's mother how to administer CPR, little Aiden would die. Caught between two worlds, following the rules or choosing to save life, Tim, the dispatcher, chose the latter. So Tim went against the rules. He broke the rules and told the mother what to do. Aiden's mother followed Tim's instructions, pinched Aiden's nose, blew some air into his mouth. Shortly afterwards, little Aiden started to respond. The truth of the matter is that the world needs more people like Tim Webb. People who value life more than rules. People who value liberation more than rules. Society needs more people like Tim Webb. People who will step up and go against the grain. We need more people like Tim Webb. People who will be bold and act to help change someone's life. But unfortunately, many people value rules more than they value changing someone's life. Unfortunately, some people value following the letter of the law, the letter of the Constitution, the letter of departmental policies, more than helping to change someone's future. Tim Webb knew that if he had not gone against the rules, he knew that if he had not broken the rules, little Aiden would be dead. If he had valued his job security more than giving life, more than saving life, 17-month-old Aiden would be dead. If Tim Webb cared more about what his supervisor might do, little Aiden would be dead. If Tim Webb cared more about the status quo than saving a child's life, little Aiden would be dead. In Mark chapter 3, this text that I read to you, we see a story where Jesus emphatically breaks the rules. We see a story here where Jesus intentionally goes against religious tradition because somebody's life needed his touch. He breaks the rules because somebody's life needed to be liberated from systems of oppression. And despite the situation in which we find ourselves, Jesus is never bound to our rules and traditions. Jesus always supersedes our boundaries in order to accomplish his purposes. Jesus pushes through the boundaries of religion in order to make his power known. God is not bound by religious tradition. He is not bound by religiosity. He is not bound by what we think. God is not bound by how we feel. God is bound only by God's own purposes. But God's power always overshadows our rules so that God's purposes might be accomplished. And not only does God break the rules, but God also empowers us to move past the things that keep God's purposes from being accomplished. So as we look at this passage today, we see 3 times when God empowers us to break the rules so that God's purposes can be accomplished. First time that God empowers us to break the rules is when someone is in a paralyzed condition. When someone is in a paralyzed condition. Here in the text, Jesus enters the synagogue. He enters the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Now, this is not the first time Jesus had entered into the synagogue. He was no stranger to synagogue worship gatherings. In fact, in Mark chapter 1, somewhere around verses 21 through 28, we see Jesus teaching in the synagogue, and he's teaching on the Sabbath. We see him casting out an unclean spirit out of a man, and people were amazed at the quality and depth and power of his teaching and the authority that accompanied it. And also we see later on in chapter 1 in Mark that Jesus is preaching local tent revivals, casting out demons all throughout the Galilean region. So Jesus really is no stranger to the synagogue. Jesus is a disruptor of synagogue proceedings that tend to move against God giving life to God's people. But here in Mark chapter 3, verse 1, something is different. Jesus sees something that he had not previously encountered in any of the synagogues. He walks into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Everybody is standing up, clapping their hands, shouting, giving God praise, giving God glory. The mass choir, if you will, is up singing. The deacons are sitting on the front row. The Hammond organ is blazing while the drums are resounding throughout the sanctuary. But in the midst of what seemed like a normal, vibrant, festive worship service, a problem existed that nobody could fix. There's a man present in the midst of everybody getting their praise on and getting what God has for them. There is a problem in the midst of that. There's a man present who doesn't look like everybody else. Yeah, there's a man present who has a physical deformity that makes him stand out from everybody else. In fact, while everybody was able to raise both of their hands in worship, this man could raise only one. Why? Because he had a withered hand. He had a shriveled hand. He had English translations say a paralyzed hand, but the Greek text says it's more of a withered hand, like the imagery of a flower that withers and dies. This man's hand was withered, and everybody in the sanctuary is worshiping, getting their praise on, and this man is not able to participate fully like everyone else. And the text does not make the claim that anybody was concerned about it. And although worship is going on, although people are tapped into corporate praise, although there are prayers being uttered in the sanctuary, and although the Spirit of God is moving in the synagogue, this man's hand remains withered. And when Jesus enters the synagogue, the first thing he sees is not how everyone is getting their praise on. He's not looking at how everyone is tapped into corporate worship, but Jesus sees a problem. He sees a man with a withered hand. Man standing in the midst of the synagogue worship, whose hand is withered. It's paralyzed. It is unmovable. It is unable to do that which everyone else is able to do. His limb is numb. There is no blood flow through it. It is paralyzed. When I moved away to Ohio many years ago, upon graduating high school, moved away to pursue my undergrad degree, I traveled a lot back and forth between Cleveland, Ohio, and Birmingham. And a lot of reason why I traveled a lot is because I missed my family and I wasn't sure whether I really wanted to stay in Ohio. So every chance I got, I was on the first plane smoking out of Cleveland, headed to Birmingham. One night I was flying from Cleveland Hopkins International Airport, headed to Birmingham, and I had a layover in St. Louis, Missouri. It was a really late flight, and most of us on the plane were tired. We had been flying all day long. We arrived in St. Louis, waited to board our flight, and once we boarded, I remember we sat on the plane for quite some time. We were sitting in our seats with our seat belts on, with our tray tables put up, and we were unable to move. We sat for quite some time, and passengers kept looking around at one another, and none of us could answer this lingering question: what's going on? Why are we not moving? And why are we stuck? Why are we in this paralyzed, immobile condition? Flight attendants finally told us over the loudspeaker that there was a mechanical problem with the plane and that we could not take off until it was fixed. We sat on the runway in a paralyzed, immobile condition until the aircraft mechanic was able to fix the plane. I want to submit to you today that there are a lot of people living in paralyzed conditions. I'm not necessarily talking about physical paralysis, but a lot of us are in paralyzed conditions. And we are stuck in these paralyzed conditions because we are so focused on religious tradition. We are so focused on getting our praise on. We are so focused on doing religious work that we miss what Jesus calls the weightier matters of what it means to be a believer, what it means to be a disciple, what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And if we see someone in a situation or condition and we do nothing to help because we are so concerned about not breaking our own rules and our traditions, then we become just like Pharisees who care more about preserving a law, care more about preserving a manuscript than preserving and making come alive the intentions of the author of the manuscript. In other words, we become nothing but curators working in a museum of cold-hearted religiosity. So, first time God empowers us to break the rules so that God's purposes can be accomplished is when someone is in a paralyzed condition. But the second time God empowers us to break the rules so that God's purposes can be accomplished is when our traditions prevent people from experiencing Jesus. When our traditions prevent people from experiencing Jesus. Look at verse 2 if you have your Bibles here. Look at verse 2 in Mark chapter 3. Notice that when Jesus enters the synagogue, there is a group of people watching him. And we know from the preceding story in chapter 2, and at the very end of our current story in chapter 3, verse 6, that the Pharisees were the ones watching Jesus. Yeah, don't forget that Jesus was this ghetto jackleg preacher, so to speak. He did not come through the seminaries of Galilee and Nazareth. He didn't have a doctor of ministry degree. He didn't have an MDiv. He just simply had a calling and a will to do what his Father sent him to do. And because Jesus was born in an unconventional way, yeah, everybody was always talking about who his daddy was. Because he was born in a very unconventional way, people were always suspect at Jesus. The establishment, rather, were the ones who were always suspect at Jesus, his motives, and his intentions. Remember, Jesus was a disruptor. Jesus comes into the synagogue. The Pharisees are the ones who are watching him, but they were watching him to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Because if he would heal on the Sabbath, then they had justification to accuse him of wrongdoing. Now, many English translations in this verse say that they watched him or they watched him closely. But I want to go a little bit deeper here, because within the Greek New Testament and any of the manuscripts, and I've looked at many of the Greek New manuscripts in preparing this sermon, it goes much deeper, because the verb that's used in verse 2 for the word watching is the word paratereo. Yeah, paratereo. And it is mainly used in the context of someone watching someone else with malicious intent. Yeah, they are watching because they are going to do something bad to you. But not only that, this verb paratereo is in what we call the imperfect tense. Yeah, which simply means that the action of the verb happened continuously in the past. They watched. Yeah, so the Pharisees were watching him in the past. It's a past action, but it has continuing effects in the present. They were continuously watching him. It is almost if you see someone coming into a store that looks suspicious, and you turn around from your shopping, and you're looking at that person, and you're just kind of eyeing them and watching them continuously, just to make sure that everything is okay, just to make sure they don't do anything crazy. This is the verbal idea we see here with what the Pharisees are doing to Jesus. They are continuously, maliciously watching Jesus as he comes into the synagogue. But their intent was to catch him in the act of healing on the Sabbath so that they could accuse him and hand him over to the state. They wanted to accuse him because he was a threat to their traditions. They wanted to accuse him because he was a threat to their religion. They wanted to accuse him because he was disrupting white supremacy. They wanted to accuse him because he was disrupting whiteness. They wanted to accuse him because he was pushing against the status quo. Jesus was showing them that God's power takes precedent over human religiosity. Jesus wanted to show them that God's power overshadows human intentions. These Pharisees in the text do not care about the man's withered hand, the fact that it's paralyzed. They do not care about the fact that he is crippled. They do not care about the fact that he has a physical disability and that he is in the midst of corporate worship and unable to fully participate like everyone else. These Pharisees care nothing about the fact that this man can't even lift both of his hands in worship to God. They do not care that his health care expenses are probably unbearable. They do not care that he struggles to go places around town because of a bad hand. What matters most to the Pharisees is that there is a strong chance that their rules regarding the Sabbath might be broken. They aren't concerned about the reason why it might be broken, but the fact that it might be broken causes them to act in a way that would prevent this man's hand from being healed. The truth of the matter is that Christians place too much emphasis on rules and traditions instead of seeing God's greater purpose. We love rules. We don't like to follow our own rules, but we love to create rules and to be in positions of authority to enforce them so that people have to bow down to the fact that we might say, you broke the rule. You can't do this. You submitted this past the deadline. I've already signed off on it. I'm not going to accept your new proposal. We can't do that because we didn't vote on it. We place too much emphasis on maintaining the way things are instead of looking at how things ought to be. And some people specialize in keeping people bound, keeping people broken and bruised, instead of helping people get out of the mess in which they live. And just like the popular saying, the church is the only institution that shoots its wounded instead of coming to the rescue of the wounded, sometimes people of faith constantly step on their necks while they're down and make sure that they never get back up. And sometimes we enjoy making people conform to the rules because it makes us feel better about ourselves. It gives us a feeling and sense of authority. It allows us to have power over somebody else. It gives us power over people's future. But Jesus came that we might have life and that we might have life more abundantly. First time God empowers us to break the rules so that God's purposes can be accomplished is when someone is in a paralyzed condition. The second time God empowers us to break the rules so that God's purposes can be accomplished is when our traditions prevent people from experiencing Jesus. And the third, final time that God empowers us to break the rules so that God's purposes can be accomplished is when the power of God outweighs our arrogance. When the power of God outweighs our arrogance. Look at verse 5 in the text. Notice what happens. After Jesus asked them about what was most important about the Sabbath, he looks around and sees that the Pharisees still don't get it. They see that the man's hand is paralyzed. They know that Jesus is the only one who can heal it. But the Pharisees refuse to concede and admit that God's power to heal was greater than their Sabbath day rules, that God's power was greater than their Sabbath day traditions. The text says that Jesus looked at them with anger and that he was grieved in his heart because they were cold-hearted. In other words, although the Pharisees knew that healing this man on the Sabbath was the right thing to do, they refused to verbally admit it. They refused to concede to God's power. They refused to move out of the way and let Jesus work the work of him who sent him. They refused to acknowledge that sometimes you've got to break the rules of tradition in order to make way for the power of God. These Pharisees loved following rules more than they loved the purposes and power of God. They loved religion more than they loved God. Am I talking to someone today? They loved the idea of religion. They loved religious dogma, religious doctrine, religious tradition, religious rules more than they loved God. Jesus has decided to show that the power of God outweighs the arrogance of religious tradition. He tells the man with the withered hand, come here, rise up in the center. In other words, get up, come into the center. I want everyone to look at what I'm about to do. And this is significant in this text because in the first century synagogues, in first century synagogues, worshipers sat on stone benches around the walls of the synagogue. And Jesus tells this man to get up and come in the middle of this circle so that everybody, regardless of what side the circle they sat on, so that everybody could witness what was about to happen. And what was about to happen was the power of God superseding and overshadowing and diluting the power of so-called religious tradition. And although the Pharisees are angry at Jesus, he tells the man, he says, stretch out your hand. In the Greek text, it says, stretch out hand. Yeah, stretch out hand. And while the Pharisees were angrily watching, Jesus did not let rules and traditions of religion prevent him from doing what he was called to do. While they were angrily watching him and watching him with malicious intent, Jesus boldly broke their rules. He went against their religious dogma. He went against their religious arrogance in order to restore this man's life, in order to restore this man's hand. He went against their religious dogma, their religious tradition. Sometimes people can be so stubborn in their own ways that they can't even see that God's power always supersedes, it is always greater than our arrogance. People can be so arrogant that they would rather see you down and out. People can be so self-centered that they will rather see you suffer. People can be so cold-hearted that they would try to block your blessings. Some Christians can be so mean-spirited that they will try to do everything in their power to keep God from blessing you. And like Pharisees, some folks will get angry just because God has a blessing with your name on it. They will get so angry because they see God preparing a table before you in the presence of your enemies. They will get so angry because they don't like what God is trying to do in your life. They will get so angry because of the way God is trying to bless you. They will become hard-hearted because God is breaking the rules just for you. But I want to submit to you today that God makes an exception just for you, just for all of us. Jesus has come to break the rules of religious tradition, to break the rules of religiosity, to break the rules of human tradition in order to help change us, in order to liberate us, in order to restore life, in order to restore us back to the image that he's created us in. Jesus breaks the rules in order that his larger purpose might be made manifest into the earth. Jesus came breaking rules. Jesus lived breaking rules. Jesus died breaking rules. And Jesus sent the Holy Spirit to empower us as believers and as disciples to be disruptors in this world, but not for the sake of creating havoc and not for the sake of being known as a troublemaker, but for the whole purpose of bringing life and liberation to those who need it. Jesus has empowered us to break the rules so that God's purposes might be accomplished in the earth.